created 2 years ago this organization or seminar really, which is called the Future Historians Study Group and Collective Writing Project. And our idea was to send out to the world some vision of a future and of ways to get there. In other words, to ask the question that we've all been asking for quite a while. Is another world really possible? And if so, can we figure out how to get from here to there? So I'd like to present to you the premises first of Future Historians. And I think Fred has a list of them. I've tried to make something like a point presentations. So I'm just going to go down it. Okay. The first premise is what we call the Pascalian bet. Pascal, the French religious philosopher, taught that if there was one chance in an infinity, in a million, that God exists and heaven exists, that the dissipated aristocrats of his time that spent their days at the gambling tables and flirtations and so on, that if they got on their knees and prayed, they would be making a very good bet, which is a chance at an eternity of bliss against the loss of a dissipated existence. And for us, the bet is simply this: is the world going to come to the end through atomic war, or through conventional war, or through epidemics, or through ecological destruction? All of these things are hanging over our heads. But we have to assume, like Pascal, that there's one chance in 100 or 1,000 for humanity to survive the 21st century. So the next premise is, number two, that if such a chance exists, we ought to be able to imagine it. Science fiction has for centuries anticipated events in the future, and so why shouldn't we be able to if it really is possible? If we can imagine it, that means that we will have made up some kind of credible utopia. And utopias have been a powerful force in the world for centuries. They've given people the consciousness that the world could be different and a goal towards which to struggle. And in the 19th century in particular, in the United States, Looking Backward by Bellamy, and in England, Morris's News from Nowhere really did bring thousands and thousands of people into the revolutionary and socialist movements. Now, today more than ever, with the future really a question mark, people need a credible, positive vision in order to continue to struggle. And I think that this is what the yellow vests are bringing us today. You know, Naomi Klein wrote 2 years ago that no is not enough. And the problem is that all of our movements up to now have been anti-something, anti-capitalist, anti-war, anti-totalitarian. All of these things are right. We have to fight against. But if we don't have something to fight for, we can never win. Now, the next premise, number 5, is that there are many advantages looking backwards, to looking from a century from now back onto what's happening now in order to give it a perspective. Marx, for example, point 6, if he hadn't believed, correctly or incorrectly, that socialism was on the agenda, that after capitalism would come socialism, it gave him the insight to look at the history of class struggles throughout the world and to see capitalism, and this was very, very important, as a temporary, limited system that after a certain number of years would decline, would collapse, and would be overthrown. And we seem to have been reaching, after 500 years of capitalism, such a point of change. Finally, looking backward simplifies complex situations. since we are starting with the assumption that there are historians in the year 2116. In other words, that something like civilization has managed to survive and have a culture, that gives us a way of plotting our course from A to B, as it were, without getting lost in all kinds of side paths. And it also keeps us from quarreling among each other as to which is the best path. Because number one, we're not struggling over power. And number two, we've all been dead for at least 60 years, starting with the youngest among us. So we decided to come together and do research and then writing to see if we could produce some kind of credible utopia. And we settled on three basic rules. Number one, no gods. Number two, no extraterrestrials. And number three, no infallible vanguard parties to lead us to the promised land, which left us with the idea of a plurality of future societies and a plurality of roads leading to them that we would observe coming up, emerging in what is for us the present, but looking backwards, a century ago. Now, we have a certain method, an evolving method, because we make our road by walking it, to see if we can get to this result. We have both a study group and a collective writing project. During the first year, the study group outlined some 20 different topics, including economics, energy, women, utopias, and so on. And we met weekly to discuss them while gathering materials in our readings on each of those specific topics. And we shared them through a Dropbox, which is a slightly complicated thing, but it enables all of us to look at the same documents and then to discuss them during the 2-hour videotaped seminars that we held for over a year. All of these seminars are available on YouTube, and so is this one, which we're doing today. And of course, we're continually adding to these various categories, which are arbitrary, but they serve as documents, as evidence, as historical and scientific and contemporary reports, so that we're talking about a utopia that is really possible and not something made up. Now, the second part is a little more difficult, and we're just embarking on it. And that is the process of collective writing. Our results, as you can see, have been posted on a wiki. And I assume, since I can't see here, that Fred has been showing you what the Dropbox looks like and eventually what the wiki looks like. So you can read our results on the wiki. And the originality of our project, as opposed to previous utopias, and are the following, really three salient points. Number one, most previous utopian fiction don't really go into how people got from capitalist barbarism to a better world. In other words, as we constantly say, from there to here, or from here to there. Secondly, the future societies proposed by Thomas More originally and his successors are all to an extent monolithic, and some of them quite distasteful. The most popular in the 19th century was Bellamy's Looking Backward, but it's a very rigid society, and I wouldn't want to live in it. William Morris's is a marvelous one, but it's based on a kind of nostalgia for an idealized Middle Ages in News from Nowhere. So we, on the other hand, are looking at a pluralistic society, which by definition would have to be a planetary society, because unless capitalism is uprooted as a world system, we're not going to make it where we need to be before the planet is destroyed. Finally, many previous utopias were not really realistic, were not really credible. in conformity with historical and known technological and scientific things that we believe. So we tried to avoid those pitfalls, and we ended up with a strange beast called Then, Now, and How. And what it is it's a history book aimed at young people in the 22nd century, trying to explain as professional historians in the 22nd century how they got from there to here, how their grandparents struggled. And this history book takes the form of an encyclopedic anthology where each reader, and there we go, the grid, each reader can enter it. For instance, let's suppose a reader is interested in cities and how they grew from the time of crumbling cities under capitalism to whatever imaginary cities that we look forward to living in the future. So a person who was interested in cities could read a chronological history of cities, from the destruction of cities through the fight for the city and to the creation of varieties of new cities. So that is the sort of vertical dimension of this encyclopedia. Okay, then we also have the temporal dimension, which is then, now, and how. So to take, what is our method? How do we do this? Well, very simple, by a combination of creative plagiarism and tense changes. All right, let me explain that. For then, we patched together a coherent narrative based on all the critical studies of capitalism in the various categories that we've been studying and discussing. And then we go ahead and change all of the tenses into the past. So for instance, under ecology, I think it was, we took one of the most recent and really rather hysterical and strident exposés of the capitalist horrors that are driving the world to destruction, and which are broadcast on, minority little sites and so on, and mostly fall on deaf ears. By putting them in the past tense and putting them in a history book, the reader perceives them as something real that have already happened. They are transformed into irrefutable historical accounts and therefore become credible. Of course, we don't steal entirely. We often give their dead authors a credit for being prescient if indeed they foresaw what would happen. But this power of the preterite, the power of putting something in the past so that you read it as, well, that's obvious, of course that happened, rather than reading it and saying, oh, these radicals, and they're always exaggerating, and anyway, there's nothing I can do about it. And nobody else seems to be talking about it, for instance, on the media. Okay, now, to do the future part of our thing, the now, we study and record every kind of predictive writing, fiction, all the authors that are advocating things like, say, municipal socialism or solar communism. And here again, we change the verbs, but not from the future. This would happen if only, or this will happen, and so on. But we put them in the present tense, explaining and extolling to our youthful 2,120 audience of young people, these are the solutions that various societies came to. And so they become reasonable and real, more creative plagiarism. Now let's get to the third part and the difficult part. That is how to get from here to there. And that's the section we call how. And there we study and recall all evidence in potential in ongoing social movements. For example, the yellow vests, which we're going to get to in a minute. Can they grow? Can they deepen? Can they converge with ongoing social movements in other places and in other spheres so as to become part of a kind of global, planetary, if you will, anti-capitalist emergence and creation of new societies? So at the same time, however, we are obliged to outline all the obstacles to be overcome by such movements to succeed. But again, we change the tenses, unleashing again the power of the preterite, the past tense. So instead of asking the question, can the yellow vests overcome French racism in the population, we answer the question from the point of view of 2119. How did the yellow vests overcome French racism? So let's go back to the questions that Fred asked at the beginning, and then we'll discuss them, but not as people today, uncertain about the future and involved in the struggle, but as historians 100 years from now. And so the questions then become, for us historians to develop in our text, and this is the writing job, how did the yellow vests sustain their numbers and militancy over the long haul? How did the yellow vests organize themselves more coherently while keeping their spontaneity and autonomy? How did the yellow vests defeat the government campaigns of brutal violence and lying propaganda relayed by the media that hate the yellow vests for a variety of reasons? How did the yellow vests overcome the racism that divides France so sharply? How did the yellow vests avoid co-optation by political parties of the left and right? How did they avoid being sucked into the official political system, as they're trying now to do with a fake kind of, not our referendum, but another one proposed by and controlled by Macron? How did the yellow vests converge with the organized industrial working classes that are still controlled by union bureaucrats? And how did they achieve a general strike? How did they continue to spread to other countries and to federate with movements there? How did they finance the social improvements under the neoliberal European Union, which prevents countries from deficit spending and doing what's necessary to rebuild infrastructure, give jobs, and so on and so forth? And finally, how did they avoid the fate of Greece, where there was a consensus on pulling out of the European Union, but the Syriza party that they elected 2 days after they were given the green light to pull out, caved in. So by asking these questions in the past tense, we come to some very different ideas. Now, let me see if I can now go to the article, the history that I drafted, which is all based on the how. Fred, can I just look at the first part of it? Or can we all just look at the first part of it, the one that I sent out? Can we put that online? Points, and then we'll open the discussion.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, so this text, it starts out in the future, and that's very important. It says that the title of the article, this history book, is The Yellow Vests and the Origins of Today's Egalitarian Peaceful Society. I can't see the whole thing, but you get the picture, okay? And it starts out by explaining that it must be very difficult for the young people a century from now to realize how horrible things were in the early 21st century and how close we came to destruction. And growing up in an egalitarian society and so on. And the reign of the super rich was finally broken, but only at the very last minute. Otherwise, there would be no air for them to breathe. And we go on along that way. Now, what this does is it's already, without defining, there's a whole now part of this history book where you can go from one topic to another, you know, from ecology to energy and women's rights and so on, and see that. But what it does is it suggests that there is such a society. And it enables to hope. And then the second part of it, it's not so surprising, themes, insurrection, and so on. We take actual history.
Richard, we're losing your audio, Richard.
Oh,
I don't know why, but we lost some of your audio there for a moment.
okay. How am I doing now?
That's fine. I think stay close to the mic and we should be good.
Okay. So the stuff from the present, from eyewitness accounts, from newspapers and so on, we put it all in the past tense. And in fact, my article really only goes up to right now, to the end of 2008, and what was achieved and so on. But it gives us a strong foundation to go ahead now and do the difficult part. And that's why we've invited you, because we're going to have to figure this out bit by bit and collectively to answer those questions. How did they overcome racism? How did they finance social improvements? And so on. So that's where I'll stop for now. I encourage you to read this and help edit it. It could use a lot of improvement. It was done very hastily, but I think that it has strength and credibility, and will give credibility to what we come up with in terms of facing the very, because let's face it, I'm 80. I've been struggling since I was 16. And even in 1968, unlike my comrades, I had no illusions that we were in a pre-revolutionary situation that could lead to a worldwide revolution. On the other hand, I've been observing the internet influence or the usefulness in everything from the Zapatistas up to this spring's strikes among the West Virginia teachers who stuck in hollows where they couldn't communicate with each other, had local groups which then federated all over the state, overcame the union bureaucracy that tried to sell them out. And not only did they win what they wanted, they pushed back a Trumpist Republican legislature, made them pay for it out of coal profits rather than taking it out of other social services, and it spread all over to the other red states. So we've seen that there is something new on the scene that helps us. And what distinguishes the Yellow Vests is that they connect by internet, but then they get together. They come out of their houses. They stand on rond-point, how do you call them, roundabouts, and at toll booths. And they gather in cities and increasingly now in general assemblies. And they come together. People are talking to each other as they never did before. And so this is a remarkable coming together of on the ground, person-to-person activity and the use of the modern internet social media technology to bring people together. So I'll stop right here and we'll see if we've got a Pascalian one chance in 1,000 or one chance in 100, Or maybe the time has come down to 1 chance in 10. In any case, the alternatives, we know what they are. We all will be dead before the end of the century, but those of you who are young will probably be fried to death one way or another, atomically or ecologically. So let's bet. Go ahead, and thank you for joining us and for listening to this.